Ladies and gentlemen, I'm super stoked to have Steve Kwan back on the podcast. Steve's a jiu-jitsu black belt, but he's best known undoubtedly for his excellent BJJ Mental Models podcast. How long has that podcast been going now, Steve?
Oh, you're going to make me feel old. I think almost 5 years now. Quite a
Yeah,
while.
yeah. It's really become a staple in the jiu-jitsu community. So congratulations.
Thanks, man. My pride and joy is doing this 5 years without missing a single episode, once every week. People talk about the
Wow.
difficulty of consistency and training there. Hey, not taken away from world champions, but try running a podcast for 5 years without missing an episode at all for any week. That I think that's pretty impressive. To me, that's a win.
What is the difference between a mental model and a concept? I'm assuming a mental model is kind of a hot term and has been for like the last 5 years. But what is the difference between that and a concept or that and a principle?
Sure. This is always a fun topic to unpack here. So, a mental model. This language first came to my vocabulary actually out of the world of finance. I hadn't heard anyone in the jiu-jitsu space talk about it. And the idea is you're basically looking for patterns that you can recognize and easily deploy against later. So if you see something in the real world happening 9 times out of 10, and your brain kind of kicks in that, hey, there's a pattern here, you're intuitively going to recognize it the next time. That's ultimately all a mental model is. It's observed behavior or an observed system, a block of knowledge that you can codify and put into your head and carry around later. Now, the thing about jujitsu is people tend to throw around a lot of terms without really defining them. And when we started this, I kind of had to look around and see what the landscape was. And yeah, people will throw around terms like mental models, ideas, systems, concepts, principles, rules, laws, and they'll use them interchangeably, but they're actually very different things. So a law is a law, right? A law is something that you have to follow, similar to a rule. So I try to avoid this terminology where I can in jujitsu because there are so few things in jujitsu that are truly absolute and universal. Even gravity, right? We call it the law of gravity. Even gravity is a theory, right? We don't rule out that one day, hundreds of years from now, there could be a theory that supersedes it. So laws are few and far between. And when people talk about laws or rules, I feel that kind of language, unless you're talking about something very, very specific, it just doesn't really work well in jujitsu because there's so many exceptions. A concept is just an idea. The word concept simply means idea. I know that a lot of people use that. It's a good term, but it's also a very broad term, right? A concept can be anything. Whereas a mental model is a more specific niche where it is I am trying to identify patterns and knowledge that I can use later again in the future over and over again. That's kind of how I define those things mentally. You'll also hear people talk about systems. Systems are often a lot like mental models. They're very similar, except that a system can be big and complicated. A mental model is usually something relatively simple. A mental model might just be one simple lesson that anyone can listen to, learn in 30 seconds, and then start deploying immediately. And I guess the interesting thing about mental models is because they're not a law or a principle, they can be anything. Anyone can define them. My mental models, the things that I've learned over the years that I deploy in jiu-jitsu might be different from yours. There might be some that work better depending on different body types and different goals. So I like the term because there's that built-in flexibility. It's more personal. It gives people the understanding that very few things in jiu-jitsu are absolute. And my hope is that through BJJ Mental Models and other resources, we can give people some quick bite-sized lessons and mental models that they can start deploying immediately when they train.
Okay. So over 5 years of podcasting every single week, you've covered quite a few mental models. So what I thought we would do today is cover maybe the top five, or if we have time, the top 10 mental models that you think help the most people, that have helped you the most, if in as much as there isn't any daylight between those two. So your top five or top 10 mental models, and just give people the skim the cream off and just serve it up to them straight, saturated fat, straight to the heart. But
Absolutely.
hopefully they can come away with some actionable ideas to help their training and some actionable patterns that they should start looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to help out there. I would say that when people think of these things in jujitsu, sometimes it's not entirely clear how something like this can actually help your jujitsu. Because when we think of jujitsu, we often think of the end result, which is a technique that we're looking at or a position that we could play. And people often wonder, how do these ideas fit in? Really, the idea here is that a mental model is something that's kind of general. Ideally, you should be able to use it pretty much all of the time. The idea is to simplify your decision making, to help you react faster, and also to help you react better when something unexpected happens. The traditional way of teaching martial arts is more technique or sequence based, right? Where I will sit someone down and I'll say, here's an armbar, here's the 10 steps to do the armbar. And the problem with doing things that way is that very rarely in the real world do things happen in that 10-step sequence. The hardest part to doing a technique is figuring out all of the weird variables that can happen in the wild, right? What happens if they zig and I expected them to zag? Or what happens if they're a foot taller than me? That changes a lot of things, right? So the idea is that with mental models, instead of giving people a step-by-step playbook of exactly what to do, which always falls apart in practice, we give them a handful of big ideas that they can just always keep in their head. And that's kind of the goal here. So hopefully it's something that's a little bit more generic. But yeah, to answer your question here, I can definitely rail off some of the main things that I've learned over the last few years. We've had the opportunity to talk to some of the best thinkers in the sport on the podcast, and I always shamelessly steal their ideas and put them into our database whenever they come on and have something good. So I'd be happy to rail off some of those ideas if you think it's a good thing to do.
There's nothing new under heaven and earth. All these people, they stole it from somebody else. It They stole it from Mongolian jacket wrestling, or they stole it from Greek pancration, or Farmer Burns appeared to them in a dream and revealed the true secrets of catch wrestling, and it just all gets recycled. So shamelessly steal, take total credit. Is there a mental model that stands out above the others? Like, what's is there an
Absolutely.
obvious first one? Okay.
The first thing that I would always tell people is to understand that, like we mentioned earlier, very few laws or principles are truly universal, especially in jujitsu. That in itself is, I think, maybe one of the most important things to understand if we want to talk about mental models. The famous quote that goes along with this is that the map is not the territory. Right, meaning that, hey, you can draw a map, but a map is an abstraction of the actual territory. And it's only useful if it's an abstraction. If you drill down into what the ground actually looks like, it's never going to be 100% the same as what the map looks like. And that's by design. That's because that's how these
A map
abstractions.
that's as detailed, a map that is as detailed as a territory
It's
would
useless.
be the territory. Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
you'd have to.
So the first thing I always encourage people to think about when they learn jujitsu is to understand that there are very few things in jujitsu that are hard and fast. And part of that means understanding that when your instructor or coach gives you instructions, usually the unspoken words under those instructions are, your mileage may vary. This is a very common problem that I know I experienced and a lot of people do with white belt, or when they're white belts, which is their instructor will say, again, I'll pick on the armbar, right? Here's how you do an armbar, and they'll give you all of the steps to do it, and then they'll walk away and you'll go and practice it. But what that instructor may not have realized is you may have interpreted that as, this is the law of how armbars are done. You must always do these steps and never vary. Whereas what your instructor probably meant is, well, in this particular situation, given what you're trying to do and given your body type and your opponent's body type, and given all of these things, here's how I would suggest you do an armbar. Usually there's a lot more variability. And where I know a lot of people can get really hung up, especially at the junior level, is they will hear instructions and it'll go into their brain and they can't get it out again. And they think this is like a law. It's universal. And a big part of understanding any concept is also understanding that they don't always apply. There's always an exception. Sometimes the exceptions are actually more important than the rules. So it isn't, it isn't really a science, so to speak. People in jiu-jitsu love to talk about how jiu-jitsu is a science or whatever. It's not really. There's so much variability in physicality and biology and strategy. You can never really truly, I think, say that jiu-jitsu is a science. And so it's important first and foremost to understand that there are no rules that are completely universal in jiu-jitsu, including this one.
Yeah, never have a straight arm in jiu-jitsu. Yeah, it's not a bad heuristic, except when you should have a straight arm in jiu-jitsu. Always fight from the top, right? Going back to my Carlson Gracie roots. Yeah, that's true, but what if the guy's like a world-class judo guy, or even just a good collegiate judo guy, and you're not? What are some other nevers and always that you hear? I mean, there's
My
how to do this technique.
Yeah.
This armbar. What people hear is this is the armbar that will always work, regardless of how it's taught. Um, but there's a whole lot of nevers and always taught as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this has probably changed a lot since I started hearing people say this, but a common one is people will say, never cross your ankles if you're on someone's back,
Mm,
right? I think that's been mostly disproven. Yes, you can get tapped out from that, but very unlikely that you're going to see that happen to anyone above white belt, and especially unlikely in a competition. It's really not that hard to be mindful of. A common example that got brought up to my attention was from Rich Franklin, of all people. He did a TED talk a while ago about the art of losing, and I really love this. He gave an example of one of the matches that he was in where he basically, I believe, and I might be butchering this, he got stuck under someone's mount and he could not get out. Nothing that he did would work. He was going to lose the fight. And at the last minute, as a Hail Mary, he decided to stick his arm straight out. Basically, he thought, my only chance here is to get out of this thing. And my best way to do that is to fake this guy into thinking he's got an armbar. And this
mhm.
is a strategy that you can do, right? If you have confidence in your defense, you can bait submissions. People will always tell you at the junior level, never stick your arm out straight. But when you're more advanced, sometimes you have to give your opponent some bait to get them to do something, because anyone who's good is not going to make a mistake just on purpose, right? You have to force them to do something. And sure enough, he raised his arm. The guy went for an arm bar, didn't work. Franklin got on top and he wound up winning the fight, right? That's terrible jiu-jitsu advice to tell someone when you're mounted, stick up an arm, give them an arm bar, and hope for them, hope they'll fall off. But I think that just illustrates that there really are no true rules. The context matters a
Mm.
lot. Whether you're trying to deceive someone matters a lot. There's many, many factors that come into play. So that I would say is a common example that, people will say things like, don't stick out your arms. They'll give you this fear that, you run the risk of being submitted at any time if one of your arms goes out straight. But by the time you've been training for a few years, you know the signs of when someone's going to try to armbar you. So you can play that against them, right? You can start sticking your arm out to try to bait them into doing something that they might not otherwise want to do.
Well, you need to clearly start a second podcast called MMA Mental Models, because the next example I'll pick of that was Sakuraba. The rule was
Yep.
never turn your back in an MMA fight. Never
Yeah.
turn your back ever, but especially in an MMA fight. And how many Gracies did Sakuraba turtle against, present his back to, and then attack with the standing Kimura or some other crazy attack? Uh, so it's never turn your back unless you're reasonably confident in your back escapes. There's actually a whole generation of Japanese fighters who would get out of mount by offering the back and then fighting their way out of rear mount. So yeah,
Yeah. And I think you
never
will see,
never's a very long time.
yeah. And I think you will see a kind of a resurgence in that sort of style. I mean, as a general rule, you probably don't want to be giving up your back if you have the option to face toward your opponent. That is fair advice. But I would also say we need to understand that part of the reason why the guard is so popular in jiu-jitsu is because traditionally the rules have favored the guard, right? To some extent, it's kind of marketing. The guard
Mm.
is the thing that makes jiu-jitsu unique. And so the rules favor going to that position. As an example, right? If
Sure,
I,
we give points for guard sweeps. We don't give points for if you have me in side control and I bridge you over. In
yes,
both cases, I've gone from the bottom to the top,
yeah. Or
and it's
similarly,
just
if
the rules. It's
Yeah, similarly, if I'm wrestling and I'm in turtle, and I shoot a double and take you down, I don't get points, right? Because turtle is not a guard. That's a very arbitrary decision. Now that's
Mhm,
changing a bit because of ADCC and other rule sets, right? But
mhm.
it's just an example again of how a lot of the things that we assume are universals are not always. There's always a counterexample. There's very few things that are 100% certain. And I mean, I know you and I have talked a lot about conspiracy theories, right? Always got to be wary of people who are 100% certain in anything.
Yeah, uh, including I. I mean, now we're going to go off on a tangent, and I swear I'll bring it back. When I fight against conspiracy theories, I fight against reflexive conspiracism, where everything is a conspiracy and everything is easier explained by conspiracy. Of course, there have been real conspiracies. They tend to be small and they tend to be short lived, but there have been real conspiracies. Just not everything is a conspiracy. So there are always examples, that's your exception. Not everything's a conspiracy, but there are once in a while there are real conspiracies. They tend to be small, they tend to be rare.
Yeah.
And we've got to drag me off this topic, or I'm just going to go down this rabbit hole.
Well, I've got a good pivot for you then. Something that
Okay.
Rob Bernacki, friend of your show and mine, has talked about a lot is thinking probabilistically when you're training. So to get away from that instinctive feeling that everything should be all or nothing, black or white, 100 or 0, one of the things Rob has discussed is that good jiu-jitsu is about creating situations where you have a high probability of getting what you want, but understanding there is no 100% thing that's always going to work, right? I mean, you could be in the best possible position and do everything right, and something crazy could happen and you could wind up losing it, even if you made no technical mistake. So a big part of jiu-jitsu is, it's kind of like gambling. It's playing these probabilities so that you can put yourselves in good situations. And I've changed my thinking in jiu-jitsu a lot to accommodate that. I mean, now, as opposed to when I was younger and less experienced, now if I get a good position, I will make sure that above all else I hold that position, right? I won't take risks that could result in me losing it, because as long as I can stay seated on top of someone in mount, I know that there's statistically a pretty good chance I'm going to get what I want, right? But if I make a mistake and you knock me over and reverse me, the odds of me succeeding at anything go down tremendously. So I used to get really frustrated because, getting arm bars from guard can be very, very difficult, especially against a trained opponent. My focus now is just on creating high probability situations like getting to mount, right? I mean, I know it sounds simple and trivial, position over submission. Everyone talks about that. But at the end of the day, there is a thinking shift that I think happens for people where they see a submission, but they have to think and realize to themselves, okay, what are my odds of actually getting this? If I am mounted on someone, but I think there's only a 30% chance I can get this armbar because they're defending it really well, I'm probably not going to go for it. I'm going to move on to something else, because maintaining my good odds from being in mount is more important than rolling the dice on some submission I might lose. So I think that that's something that ability to think from a nuanced, probability-based standpoint is really important in jiu-jitsu, as well as in other walks of life as well, right? To understand what the odds really are and not to try to get trapped in this all or nothing thinking that seems to plague so many people out there.
Yeah. At the same time, I can guarantee that I can paint a scenario where I can guarantee you're going to go for that armbar. You're competing. You're down by 4 points. You're in mount, and there's 10 seconds left.
Yeah.
At that point, you will go for that low percentage armbar because it's the only way that you can win at that point.
Exactly. So again, another example of how the rules don't always apply, right? The clock is often just as much a consideration as your opponent. If you've got 10 seconds left and you've got one shot to win something because you're down on points, it makes all of the sense in the world to take that. I mean, unless you want to achieve some weird moral victory about how you ended the fight on top, but that doesn't show up in anyone's records, right?
No. What would be another mental model that you've found very useful and very applicable?
Yeah, so I'll get into the specifics of like the mechanical side of jiu-jitsu, but I often like to lead off with a few things that are kind of higher level, like the things we just talked about. But another thing that I would always say is, look, if you give me someone new who's never done jiu-jitsu before, and we want to train them to be half decent, before I show them anything, before I show them any techniques or positions, or even before I explain to them what jiu-jitsu is, the first thing I would want to equip them with is some knowledge about how to remain loose, relaxed, calm, and control your breathing. I really think that is more important than almost anything. It is a very common beginner error to be too tense all the time. This is something that your opponents can actually yeah, exactly. This is something that your opponents can actually read. I mean, I didn't believe this when I started off out, but I remember all of the brown and black belts telling me you got to loosen up because the other person can read your intentions if you're tense. And it's absolutely true. The other thing too is, it's a lot easier to get leverage over something that's stiff than something that's loose, right? If my grips are loose and relaxed, it's going to be harder for you to get Kazushi on me or off balance me. But the problem is if you're tense, then it's very easy for me to just grab your arm, your leg, and move it where I want it to go. There is also that psychological aspect, right? The tenser you are and the more ragged and distressed you're breathing, the more that impacts your own psychology, right? It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because you're actually going to stress yourself out more. So learning to stay cool and calm under pressure, not panic, not freak out. I mean, in my mind, that is actually the most important thing that jiu-jitsu can give you, right? Because it's very hard to succeed at anything if you go into panic mode. So, but that's also easier said than done. That's something that has to be deliberately trained. And that's why I think it's so important to bring that up to people so that they know they have to train it.
The control of the breathing is, I mean, it obviously has benefits, but it's also a way to control the mind. I mean, there is some breath-mind connection there. If you start hyperventilating without a good reason, I mean, that will change your state of mind, and certainly you're going to tire out a whole lot faster. Uh, so I actually think that that's probably the most important self-defense lesson in jiu-jitsu. I can't count the number of times I've gone against a big, strong guy, got into a top position after surviving the initial 30 seconds of thrashing, and then just not even smothered them, just proximity them into panic. And then they burn all their energy, and then it's taking candy from a baby, because after they've tried to max bench press you off of them for the 10th time, there's nothing left there to defend with. And in a self-defense scenario, being able to continue thinking is probably more important than being able to fight. Should I even fight? That is a decision that you need to make. Should I run? Which way should I run? Should I arm myself? Should I call for help or not call for help? Should I try and get my phone out? Should I be filming this? Should I be worried about other people arriving? Should I be hoping for other people to arrive? All these are things that require mental bandwidth. And if you're so physically freaked out, you're not going to be thinking. You're going to become stupid.
Yeah.
And you might do something very well, but it would be the absolute wrong thing to do.
Right. I mean, winning a jiu-jitsu match is ultimately about decisions. It's about making good decisions, making them faster than your opponent, and making better decisions. So if your decision-making ability is compromised because you're freaking out or you're stressed or your breathing is out of control, it's going to be very hard to get anything done, right? And that's a lesson. And again, we call it a mental model here because it's kind of applicable to other areas of life. That's just generally good practice, learning to stay cool under pressure. To me, that's actually one of the main reasons to train jiu-jitsu is because it can give you some of that confidence. Whereas if you go into any high-stress situation, if you cannot remain relaxed and calm, control your breathing, control the symptoms of stress, it's going to be very hard for you to succeed in that situation. Jiu-jitsu being just one of those.
So then how do you reconcile, say, the mental approaches to judo versus wrestling? Like wrestling is famously intense. The level of intensity of a wrestling match, even a wrestling practice, is, call it 8 out of 10.
Yeah.
Whereas two jiu-jitsu guys rolling around, oh, my friend, we go make some flow. That's going to be 3 to 5 out of 10. Yet wrestlers are also making decisions. Mm-hmm. They're also making decisions very quickly. But they're much more physically engaged. They're using much more of their capacity, mostly because they're young and dumb and in great physical shape, whereas the average jiu-jitsu practitioner isn't anywhere near the physical shape that you would need to be to maintain that intensity and keep going. So how do you reconcile those two approaches? Because, like I said, clearly the wrestlers, they are making decisions while working their absolute asses off with insane physical,
good question.
Insanely physical exercise.
So staying loose and controlling your breathing that doesn't mean you're not working hard. And it doesn't mean that there's never a time to tense up. It just means that your default should be that you're loose and you control your breathing. And that's something that's consistent across other martial arts as well, right? I mean, if you look at judo, for example, there is a relaxed period and then there is an explosive period where you go for a throw, right? Where everything tenses and then you try to just in 1 second just get all, hit the person with as much force as you can. But up until that point, you want to stay a little bit loose because you don't want to give the person too much leverage over you. You don't want them to be able to read you. You don't want to burn out your grips when there's no point. So again, this is another example of that nuance, right? When you say that you want people to be loose, we don't mean that you're just a wet noodle and you just sit there and you let people beat them up, right? Yeah, exactly. Even in jiu-jitsu, I mean, at a high level, people can't get away with that, flow roll attitude that you do in the gym where you just sit there and kind of let things happen. You still need to be aggressive in jiu-jitsu if you want to be good at it. But there's a difference between being aggressive because you're out of control and being aggressive because you're calm, you're strategic, it's part of a plan, you're doing it in a way that's smart and makes sense. And even wrestlers do this. Someone we've had on our podcast is Nick Perler, a wrestling coach from Perler Wrestling Academy in Missouri. And he's talked a lot about the importance of staying loose and relaxed. And that is just kind of one side of physicality, right? And going out there and being aggressive doesn't just mean you're completely out of control and you're a lunatic. It means you're calm and relaxed and you're focused and you're driven to win and succeed and you're just relentless at doing that. But you can do that while still, to some extent, controlling your breathing, while not tensing up and avoiding burning energy until it's time to do so. You can still do all of those things, but it's just a matter of like knowing when it's productive to explode and when it's just a waste of energy.
Yeah, I mean, I set that up in kind of a false dichotomy of loose versus relaxed. I mean, if certainly running the 400 meter, running 400 meters or running 100 meters or running 200-meter hurdles takes an insane amount of energy, but they're not tensing every single muscle of their body for the entire time that they're running. Because if they did, they would be like robots trying to move down. They wouldn't go very fast. I got excited there and hit my camera. They're tensing the right muscles at the right time for the right duration of time.
Yeah,
and that might be 400 steps or 400 strides, but there's a pulse of tightness followed by some measure of relaxation. Otherwise, they would run out of energy and run a third as fast as they're able to run.
And the context is different too, right? Because if the rules of jiu-jitsu were, the first person to throw the best punch in under 3 seconds wins, I mean, that's going to dramatically change the approach towards being relaxed or not. But jiu-jitsu is...
Or even 15-second rounds.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, jiu-jitsu is not a sprint like that, though. It's more of a marathon. And for that matter, all combat sports are. I mean, other than power slap, I'm not aware of a combat sport that takes place in seconds rather than in minutes. So that's where that comes into play. But yeah, I mean, if you're talking about an activity where you've got a different clock and you've got different goals, then the rules might be different here. In combat sports, though, and in most sports, just because no one is an endless gas tank of cardio, there's always going to be some benefit to being loose when it makes sense to and waiting for the moment to explode.
Yeah. And maybe tensing just your arm,
yeah,
but not your entire body.
The way that I like to think of it is, think of like a whip, right? A whip is loose and relaxed most of the time, but when you whip someone, right, when you crack it, you're basically channeling all of that force into a small area for just a pinpoint second of time, and it can do a boatload of damage. And that's kind of how we want to think about staying loose, right? We are a whip. We're loose and until it's time for the whip to crack, and then we explode. I guess the next thing to talk about, and I know it's come up on your show before, is alignment. Probably my favorite intro to jiu-jitsu mechanics. If you want to explain what jiu-jitsu is and how the body works, alignment is a good way to do it. It's a theory that's been kind of pioneered by Rob Bernacki, friend of your show. You've done, of course, a ton of amazing instructionals with him. I would say that if anyone wants to better understand this stuff, probably the best resource to do that is the core BJJ formula, the instructional that you did with Rob. So get it now on grapplearts.com. Anyway, this is a plug. But alignment, I know it's been discussed ad nauseum, but basically what it says is Jiu-jitsu really, when it comes to how you manipulate someone's body, it's all about three things. It's about base, posture, and structure. And that's what alignment is. It's kind of like this. It's got three components: base, posture, and structure. At all points in time, you want to be maintaining your base, posture, and structure, and you want to be taking it away from your opponent. Base is your ability to generate or absorb force relative to your goals. So if you're trying to, shoot a double, when you plant your foot on the ground and you try to explode forward, you're doing that because you've got base. If your feet were floating around in the air, then you have no base, right? And the lesson there is you always want to be connecting to something because that's how you can generate force, and you want to take away your opponent's ability to do that. So a lot of good jiu-jitsu involves trying to neutralize people's hands so they can't grab onto anything or push pull, trying to keep their feet off the floor in a lot of positions because they can't base, right? That's an example of attacking someone's base. It's why things like the stack pass suck so much to have done to you, because if your feet are just sitting up in the air, there's really not much you could do. You have no base. That's what base is all about. Rob has always said that base is kind of the most important of the three. So I hope that that's a good definition for base. A mistake a lot of instructors make is they will tell people to have base, but they won't define it. That's the definition that Rob uses and that I have shamelessly stolen. He also talks about posture and structure as being part of alignment. Posture basically is how effective can you use your spine going up to your neck. Structure is how effective can you use your limbs, so your arms and your legs. Really simple stuff, right? We're not going into some big complicated masterclass about your left arm goes here, your right leg goes there, right? It can be almost impossible to keep all of that in your head. So the thing that's great about alignment is when I'm sparring with someone, I don't have to be thinking about, ooh, what's the right move to do here? Should I do a scissor sweep? Oh, where does my foot go if I do a scissor sweep? You can kind of abstract that and make it fade away a bit. And all you need to be thinking of at any point in time is, do I have my base? Which means, can I generate or absorb force? Can I push off of something? If my opponent pushes me, can I brace for impact? Do I have posture? Meaning, look, can I turn my spine the way I want it to? If I can't turn my head because I'm being cross-faced, my posture's compromised. And finally, do I have structure? Do I have the free and unrestricted use of my arms and my legs, or is my opponent tying them up? And I would posit that for most people, if they are new to jiu-jitsu and they abandon any preconceived notion of what techniques they should do, and they just try to focus on all times at making sure they've got base, they've got posture, and they've got structure, they're going to be a lot harder to deal with at the beginning, at least. And even through the black belt level, that becomes a very productive way to look at things because it's just easier to make decisions on the fly if you only have three things to think about in your head: base, posture, structure. So again, alignment is one of my favorite ways to explain the nuances of jiu-jitsu body mechanics to people. Now, I know that you literally made the instructional on this, Stephan. So did I miss anything? That's how I normally define it. But if you've got any more details to add, please share.
I think it took me a while to realize that base doesn't necessarily mean base on the floor. One example might be, say you've got a huge neck and I've got a rear naked choke locked in and I'm squeezing with my arms, I'm squeezing with my chest, but it's just not enough because you've got a couple of fingertips in there and you've just got a massive neck. In that case, I'm probably going to activate my hip bridge, using my arching back to apply that last bit of power I need to get you to tap out. In that case, I'm not basing on the floor. I'm using you as the platform from which I'm going to generate power. I'm going to put in my hooks, if they're not already in, maybe cross my ankles, maybe not. But then anchoring on you, I'm going to be arching up. So that's or in some variations of the armbar, I might be doing the same thing. My base might be on you. I just need a platform from which to apply force. And that might be the floor. It might be your body. And sometimes when I'm training jiu-jitsu for the streets, which really translates to we've rolled over towards the wall and I don't want to stop, you might be generating base on the wall. You might be, doing that running up the wall escape from side mount that's so much fun. Or I finished a Von Flew the other day where we were close enough to the wall where I walked my feet up onto the wall and then
You did a vertical Von Flew where you were just upside down?
Diagonal.
Nice.
Diagonal.
Nice.
And yeah, it worked. So I'm generating base off of a wall. And I really like I think it's Rob's conceptualization of it, the idea of what's the score. If you and I are grappling and you're in good base, say we're in your guard and you've got good base, good posture and good structure, but you've managed to compromise me somehow. Maybe you've twisted my arms. We're in the gi and you've crossed my arms. My base and my posture are all right, but my structure is now screwed. So you get 3 points, one for base, one for posture, one for structure, and I get 2 points, one for base, one for posture, but 0 for structure. When there's a score difference of 1 point, 3-2 say, then probably you can hit a sweep. But now say a 3-2 difference, usually you can hit a sweep. A submission's kind of unlikely if we're equal skill, equal size. Now say you sweep me and you get to mount and you manage to get a really good crossface in and you manage to jack my arm up. You've destroyed my structure, you've destroyed my posture. I still have base maybe, but now you've got 3 points and I've got 1 point. When it's 3-1 or 3-0, then it's time to go for a submission. I think that's a very useful model of when you should sweep, when you should go for a submission, and also in the case of working from the guard, when you should use kazushi, when you should try to off-balance somebody just enough to compromise at least one of those. I mean, obviously, if you do a kazushi and the guy flops over and you get to the top, winner, chicken dinner. But most of the time, most initial sweep attacks work to destabilize the other guy. And functionally, that means you've either compromised their base, or you've compromised their posture, or you've compromised their structure. So I thought that asking yourself, what's the score in this situation, is a very useful heuristic. I don't know, have you played with that?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually have that documented as part of our instructions for applying alignment on our site. Rob talks about this and calls it the alignment scorecard. It's the simplest scorecard I've ever seen. The idea, you basically, if you can count to 3, you can do this. And the idea is at any point in time, you want to be asking yourself, do I have base? Do I have posture? Do I have structure? Give yourself 1 point for each of those. Then do the same for your opponent. Give 1 point to them for each of those. Whoever has more points is probably in a better position. This can also be helpful because beyond just helping you identify whether you're in a good spot, it can help you identify what the thing is that you should do next. So as an example, if I'm passing side control on you and I'm really struggling to hold you down, I want to ask myself, do you, my opponent, have base, posture, and structure, right? And if you've got one of those things, maybe I should attack it. So for example, that's why cross-facing someone or getting a strong collar grip from side control tends to be so important, is because that's an attack on their posture. If I twist your head and turn it away, you can't look toward me. And if you can't look toward me, then basically half of your escape options are gone. You can no longer regard. All you can do now is you can Granby, you can turtle, you can do stuff like that, but you can't do any forward-facing defenses. So that can often be a handy thing. If you're stuck in a position and you just can't get any forward progress and you don't know what to do because either you're just not comfortable with the position or you're new to jiu-jitsu, just ask yourself, do they have base? Do they have posture? Do they have structure? If they have any of those, start attacking them, right? It doesn't have to be sophisticated. Twist their head the wrong way. Try to pull their arm across the center line of their body. Try to immobilize their hips and their knees, right? That's just a much easier way to remember what's got to be done next. Because again, if you can count to 3, you can use that alignment scorecard method, which makes it, as far as I can tell, simpler than pretty much any other conceptual system in jiu-jitsu for explaining the whole darn thing.
Oh. So you're saying that tiny Amazonian tribe that had the linguistic structure completely unlike any other language, that Piranha, I think it is, and they count to 3 and that's it. So you're
they
saying
could do it, man.
Do jiu-jitsu.
We got to send Bernanke down
All
there
right.
to train them. It's going to be amazing.
Yeah.
Yep.
And we'll include the bow and arrow and the blowpipe. I'm not sure what their weapons are. I imagine it's bow and arrow and blowpipe.
You don't need that. Hand-to-hand combat, obviously, in jiu-jitsu, right? Real weapons don't happen. Jiu-jitsu is all the self-defense you need, It's my understanding.
Is it all the hunting tools that you need, though?
No, probably
there aren't
not.
very many animals of worthwhile caloric amounts that are easy to kill by hand.
Well, I mean, they call it the lion killer, right? So I'm going to presume at some
Oh,
point in time someone tried this. I don't know if they succeeded. Yeah.
okay. So you can hunt very small marsupials and lions.
Yeah.
Excellent.
But yeah, I mean, anyway, that I generally think that if someone has kind of got past those first few initial steps and they've gotten onto the mats for the first time and they want to understand a broader framework for how all of these things fit together, alignment is probably a good day one conversation to have with people about what they should learn. For those reasons, it just helps explain and tie so many things together. When I started jiu-jitsu, there were no such conceptual systems. So it was just you come in and one day you're doing technique A, and the next day you're doing
Mm.
technique B, which is completely unrelated. And it's just a random grab bag of stuff. And no one ever sat me down and said, here's the framework for how all of these things fit together. So what wound up happening is it wasn't until I was, about a year plus into this that I'd been to enough of those classes and seen enough of the pieces of the elephant, that I was able to actually visualize in my mind how all of these things fit together. Would have been real nice if someone had just sat down to talk to me about alignment on day one. So I think for many people, that is a first good intro to jiu-jitsu as a whole, and also why everyone should buy the core BJJ formula with you and Rob Bernacki at grapplearts.com.
So we've covered that there is no 100%
Yeah.
in jiu-jitsu. We've covered don't panic.
Mhm.
We've covered alignment.
Yep.
What would you say the way things are going here? We've got time for a couple more.
Yeah.
What would you say your
So
next another common mental model is that's super useful for
yeah.
people?
Okay. So I like to kind of attack things in the order that a new person is going to likely encounter things. So generally, I want to start with the big important ideas, then get into stuff like alignment. And the thing that every beginner is gonna struggle with is defense and staying safe, right? Not just defense in the context of how do I not get tapped, but also defense in the context of how do I not get accidentally injured, especially when I'm so new at this that I don't know what I'm doing. Injuries at the white belt level, especially, I think are probably way more common than people want to admit. My personal experience has been as I get older, injuries get less likely just because I have a better understanding of how my body works and what not to do and what would be considered dangerous. There's probably a lot of people out there who could have been amazing grapplers if not for the fact that they had a catastrophic injury at white belt, right? And I think that anyone out there who is attempting to teach jujitsu owes it to their students to give them a comprehensive guide on how to be safe when they train. So the next thing I would
It
talk
doesn't
about.
even need to be it doesn't even need to be a catastrophic injury.
Mhm.
How many white belts show up for a week, get their arm cranked by some hyper enthusiastic blue belt who wanted to teach them a lesson? They didn't say nothing, but they just never came back.
Yeah.
Fuck this. I'm gonna go do pickleball. Uh, that's not a catastrophic injury, but it's a preventable injury, perhaps, that is that drove people off, and we never even found out about it. We
Yeah.
don't even know. It's just part of white belt flight
Yeah.
that we
Absolutely.
take for granted.
I was just talking about this in the lab the other day when we were training, and we were theorizing that honestly, I don't have the data to prove it, but if you were to tell me that things like strokes were way more common in jujitsu than we expected, I would believe it at this point because I got the feeling that probably ultimately what we're doing is we're trying to strangle each other, right? We're trying to cut
Mm.
off blood flow to the brain. I would not be surprised if that winds up not being exactly as harmless as we had been led to believe when we started. Again, I'm just starting rumors here. I can't prove it, but it's kind of another example of where, look, if someone got really badly injured, if they had a stroke or something, if they were a white belt, they had a really bad experience, had a catastrophic injury in the first month and left, would the other people at the gym know about that? Would they even know that that person is gone? So I do feel like, especially at the beginner levels, you have to be way more careful because you just don't know how to stay safe. So you're going to make dumb mistakes. And I think equipping people on that is probably the best thing you can do as an instructor, which is where I would introduce the next ideas here. Something that we've said on the podcast before many times is we've told people don't be a tetherball. And by that, I mean, look, there's a lot of moves in jiu-jitsu where I can fasten myself onto you, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing. Bernacki calls that a clamp, right? So closed guard is a clamp-based system where I am crossing my legs behind you and I'm trying to pull you down and I'm trying to be a very aggressive
Mm.
front-facing backpack to prevent you from posturing up and standing up and breaking my guard. And there's a lot of positions like that in jiu-jitsu. But the advice I generally have for people is to avoid situations where you clamp onto someone, but they've got control of the body mass and you don't. So closed
Mm.
guard, as an example, right? If I am able to close my guard on you and pull you down and you're just stuck in my guard, that's fine, right? That's not a problem. But I mean, if you want to see an example of where that can get dangerous, just look in the UFC where slamming is legal. There's a lot of examples of someone, refusing to let go of close guard, getting lifted up in the air, and then just getting slammed and KO'd or otherwise grievously injured, right? So well, I think of this like a tetherball, right? If you're going to clamp onto someone, make sure that you're the one with the control and not them, especially if there's a big size disadvantage, right? And that's where I think this is so important, is because smaller people usually wind up being the tetherball. So there's a lot of things that at a junior level you need to just be mindful of. Like if I try to jump your back while you have relatively good base, you're probably not going to just fall down, right? There's a good chance you might pick me up, and even by accident, you might slam on top of me. That's not to say you can never do these things, but it's to say just be mindful that there is a risk, right? If I close my guard and you pick me up and hold me up over my head, there is a risk. Is now granted, slamming is not legal under most jiu-jitsu rule sets, but you can't control if your opponent loses their balance and falls on top of you, right? So tethering yourself to a person, especially if you're smaller, is always something that you need to think about. That comes into play with things like triangles, with closed guard, with any position where you're locking onto the person. You always need to be asking yourself, like, who's got the pull here? Am I able to move them, or am I basically just a tetherball going along for the ride at this point? And my advice to most people is, if you are the tetherball, it's probably better to get out of there, because even if slamming is illegal under your current rules, accidents happen, right? If you're like holding on to someone and they fall over, you can't control, and neither can they, what's going to happen sometimes. So for safety, I usually tell people to be mindful of who's tethered to who at any given moment.
I believe it's a rule in judo that if you have me in a triangle choke, say, and I lift you off the floor, that the hold is considered broken.
I've
And
always thought,
that's be-
yeah, I don't know. I'm not a judo guy, but I have always thought that that would be like a simulated slam rule would probably be
mm,
interesting to explore in jiu-jitsu, right? If
yeah.
I pick you
Like
up in a
if you
power
lift,
yeah, I mean, if I
yeah,
power bomb you, if I
if you
have you
lift,
up in the air, there's no need for me to finish the slam. It should just be something should be awarded there. But right now, people
yeah,
are not discouraged from abandoning that position, so they will hold on to these really crazy, weird positions where they're basically just being dangled upside down.
yeah. It's certainly we've seen how dangerous things like flying arm bars can be. I've seen people
Mhm.
knock themselves out going for flying arm bars. Not to say that uh, that's should be banned, but I wonder, it'd be a minor rule addition that, say, if you have me a triangle choke and I lift you above my waist, say, that the triangle choke is broken. I'm not sure that if you have me in your closed guard and I stand up, that you should be forced to open your closed guard. But, it'd be a rule that we could experiment with. It would make people much better at breaking posture as well. I know that if I got to a triangle choke under that rule set, I would be doing I should be doing everything I can to stop you from standing up and posturing. But that would just be one more incentive. I'd be underhooking your leg like crazy,
Yeah,
or your shoulder.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
the
It's interesting though, because when you start messing with the rules, there can be unintended consequences, right? You add
mm,
a rule like that and you might wind up altering the metagame such that now everyone is trying to lift up their opponent for no reason, right? The more rules you put in,
mm.
the more you can kind of deviate the sport from what it was intended to be. So it's a tough one. I don't know. I'm glad I'm not the guy who has to make the rules, because I think it's harder than most people expect.
The tetherball effect. I'm a bigger guy, but it's the one ACL I've ever torn doing leg locks. And I there was a big guy, very athletic, very spazzy, very new. And I sat back for a basic ankle lock, and I was just holding his leg, and I was looking at him, and I was very slowly applying it. And he turned himself into the tetherball. He spun as hard as he could one way, and he
Mhm.
spun as hard as he could the other way. Then he screamed and started dry heaving. And I had done nothing. I'd been
Jeez.
sitting there holding his ankle, and he did it entirely himself. However, that's my fault. I think a fairly experienced blue belt at the time, I should have realized that this guy knew nothing. I should have realized that this guy was in danger of hurting himself. He had turned himself into a tetherball. His ankle was very firmly clamped. I didn't have great control over the rest of his body, and he's spinning around like crazy. So yes, don't be the tetherball, but also, especially if you're more experienced, don't allow that idiot that you're going with to become a tetherball, because beginners will hurt themselves.
Yeah.
They will thrash, and they will either injure you, or they'll injure themselves, or they'll injure somebody else on the mat. They are, cruise missiles of destruction, but it's not very specific as to what's going to get destroyed. Something's going to get destroyed, and your job as a I was going against a young guy recently, and I had him in a triangle choke, and he kind of stood up and threw himself across my body like trying to dive horizontally.
Oh, the Chael Sonnen thing, right? Where you throw your body sideways over top of the person to try to break their legs open.
Not even that much intention. It was just a wild leap for freedom. And at least I had enough intelligence to let go, because I didn't know what would have happened. Something, it was such a weird explosive motion that I didn't know where his neck was going to land. I didn't know how his arm was going to get caught in between our falling bodies, and I didn't know what was going to happen to my knee. So after many years of experience, I refused to let the tetherball effect happen. I don't want another torn ACL or something else on my conscience.
Yeah, and it's a tough one to tell people about, because you absolutely can be a tetherball if you choose to. I mean, there's a lot of people in high level competition who will do this, but you are rolling the dice, right? Bad things can happen if you allow the other person to fully control your body weight. If you are locked onto them and you are the tetherball, bad things can happen. And that's just a risk assessment that people have to make, which is, do I want to assume that risk, knowing that accidentally or not, I could get dumped on my head, dumped on my back, I could get my leg ripped off by accident, right? Do I accept that risk? That's going to come down to, who you are and whether you're in a tournament at the time that you're training. All of these things are going to kind of cause an impact there. But that's my tethering advice. I guess another thing that I've spent a lot of time trying to square away a definition on is when to retract and extend your arms and your legs, right? Or even your neck, right? When do you stick your neck out and when do you retract it like a turtle? Common jiu-jitsu advice is have T-Rex arms. The idea is, you retract your arms, keep them in tight, and that's good advice in a lot of situations. Other common advice you'll hear about retracting stuff is people will say, have a strong elbow-knee connection. The idea is you're kind of retracting everything and you're closing off space to some of the more compromised parts of your body, like your ribs. And it's good advice, but the problem is there are always a lot of exceptions. And something that I was talking to John Thomas about and he brought up is, look, he gets that advice, he understands it, but there's a lot of stuff that people like him do where you're extended like crazy. A lot of long step passes, a lot of gi-based guards. They require you to extend your arms and legs. So clearly it does work. And the problem is if you tell people stay, keep your arms and elbows in all the time, what you're going to wind up with is a bunch of turtles, right? Just people who are kind of constantly in a defensive ball. And I mean, that is a strategy, but it's very hard to get anything done from that standpoint. So how do you square this away, right? And the definition I've come up with is, think about like a boxer, right? If you walk into a boxing gym and you don't know anything about it, some of the first advice they're going to tell you is, you want to keep your hands up, you want to keep your chin down, want to focus on moving. Even if you don't know anything else, that's probably going to be something that they say. And it's easier said than done. You see very experienced boxers who need to be reminded of this, because when someone's trying to punch you, sometimes these things fall off, right? So that's not to say that a boxer always has their chin down and their hands up. I mean, if I want to throw a punch at you, at some point, I have to move my arm out of that position, right? I have to wind up and I have to explode and put all of my body weight and all of that force through that punch to hit you. So that means by definition, my hand is no longer up in front of my face blocking a punch. So it's a trade-off. And the way that I think of this whole idea of staying coiled in jiu-jitsu, like keeping your elbows in and your neck tucked and your knees in, is much like the chin down, hands up advice. it should be your default in jiu-jitsu to be coiled up. Meaning if you don't know what the hell you're doing, if you have nothing better going on, if you don't have anything that you're specifically trying to achieve, your default should be deny access to your arms, deny access to your legs, deny access to your neck. But if you're ever in a situation where you need to generate some power, and more importantly, you are confident you can do it without your opponent making you pay for it, then it's totally fine to extend things. So that's why shooting a double is okay, right? I am extending my leg, my back leg, when I shoot a double to generate power, but it's okay because you can't really do anything to exploit the fact that I've done that. You compare that to, again, going back to the mounted armbar, right? That's a situation where in most cases, I probably don't want to extend my arms out because it doesn't, in most cases, it doesn't achieve anything unless it does. And there are some lunatics out there who either are really good at extending to bait an armbar, or in some cases, they are really good at latching onto some fabric and just pushing you off. I mean, people in jiu-jitsu will always tell you bench pressing is not a valid mount escape. It's not a valid armbar escape. And all I have to say to that is, yeah, try telling that to the guy who outweighs me by 100 pounds, who does that all the time, right? I mean, there is a point in time where that can be done. And I actually know really good grapplers who will do that, but they're smart about it. They don't just stick their hand up where I can grab it. They've always got it anchored onto fabric or something where they can make the space. So that's kind of the definition I've settled on for coiling is your default, much like a boxer, should be you keep everything retracted, but when you can do it safely without them doing anything to you in return, and when there's a reason to do it, then you can explode. Then you can stick your arms and your legs out to generate that power.
Yeah. A great illustration of that would be two complementary guard retention mechanisms, one of which is elbow-knee connection, and that's a fantastic tool to have in the toolbox, especially if you're recumbent, especially if you're flat on your back. Yet, at the same time, something like framing and hip escaping, where you're sitting up, making a frame with your arms, bring your feet in towards your ass, and then kind of shrimping while sitting, is the very definition of extending. First you're extending your arms, then you're extending your legs. So they're not, neither one of them is gospel. It's like having a hammer and a screwdriver in your toolbox. There's a time to use the hammer, there's a time to use the screwdriver. Not every problem in the world is solvable by one of those tools. Not every guard pass is defendable just with elbow-knee connection. Not every guard pass in the world is defendable with framing and hip escaping, just as not every thing that you need to fix in your house is fixable with a hammer.
Exactly.
Satisfying though a hammer is.
Yeah. So, I mean, the way I think of it is much like that, right? If I can throw a punch, if I want to hit you and I think I can hit you without getting hit back, then sure, I can drop the defenses and I can extend. But if I am concerned about leaving those openings, that's when I'm going to stay defensive. So when you are going for those kinds of extending escapes, like the stiff arm to retain your guard, part of the important way to do that is to make sure that you're doing it at such an angle that your opponent can't just grab your hand and do something to you, right? I mean, a good example of this, again, is how Rob does this. I know he does a lot of like full arm extension, guard retention motions. But if you look at the pictures of him in your instructionals doing it, it's always at such an angle where the person can't just grab the arm and latch on an arm bar or grab the arm and go into side control or kesikatame. The angle is always just too far off for you to do that. Because otherwise, I mean, if you try to pass my guard and I just put my hand up in front of you, I'm actually making it way easier for you to just get that inside space and, defeat my elbow-knee connection because I have none. So that's the way I think about it. And I found that to be a useful way to visualize, when you should have the defenses up and when you should attack. So yeah, I guess one other thing I would also talk about here, I mean, at that point, we've talked so far about a lot of defensive things. There's something I would want to clarify when it comes to offense that a lot of people don't have a good definition of, and that is like, what exactly is pressure and how does it work? Jiu-jitsu people, again, much like with base, they will always talk about pressure and how important it is, but they often can't define it. I have had discussions with very good grapplers who have given me a definition of pressure and told me how I should be using this definition. And I have to tell them, like, there is actually a definition for what pressure is, and you're inventing something, right? There is a way to actually define this. Pressure basically is a ratio of force to surface area, right? If I can generate a lot of force on a small amount of surface area, that's a lot of pressure. That's the reason why, a surgeon is going to use a scalpel and not a spoon, right? The smaller surface area means that they're going to be more likely to do what they need to do there. And similarly in jiu-jitsu, that's the reason why certain high pressure moves like knee on belly or a crossface, they suck so bad, because you're taking your entire body weight and you're driving that force through just one part of your body, whether it be your shoulder or your knee or whatever that point of connection is. And this matters because if I'm trying to put actual pressure on you, then it usually behooves me to use as little surface area of my body as possible. So for example, if I have side control on you, if I'm just a wet blanket and my weight is evenly distributed, it's relatively easy for you to maneuver out of there. But if I switch my angle so that I've got fewer points of contact with you, where maybe all of my weight is coming down through my shoulder and my arm and into your jaw, that's a lot of pressure, right? Same with knee on belly. The reason that position sucks so bad to get stuck in is because all of your weight is being channeled down through your knee and your shin into the other person's body. So that's actually the way that pressure is defined, right? Now, that said, in the context of jiu-jitsu, there's other types of pressure that don't meet the textbook definition, right? And psychological pressure is very much a real thing. So sometimes people will do things that don't technically generate the most pressure, but they make the other person's life suck to the point where it kind of generates a form of psychological pressure. Common examples are if I kind of go to like a pit stop position. So maybe I'm trying to pass your guard. I'm like 3/4 of the way there, but I kind of intentionally bait you into thinking you can regard. I let you do it, and then I just pass again, right? I can double up my guard pass points if I do that. And it's tremendously demoralizing to people when you do that. So when people talk about pressure, in addition to the physical aspect, there is that psychological aspect of pressure where you try to break someone mentally. That's kind of a different thing from actually generating physical pressure. So there's a lot of people who will play what they consider pressure positions, but they're not actually generating physical pressure on the person. They're generating that kind of like emotional, mental pressure. That's where a lot of those wet blanket smother type positions come into play. It's not actually meeting the definition of what generates pressure, but it's more a form of psychological warfare, right? So that things like the smother, for example, technically it's not generating a lot of pressure, but I don't care how good you are. If I can prevent you from breathing, it's going to completely make you fall apart, right? So things like that, it's a different way to define the word. So what I always tell people is to understand that, right? There's these different forms of pressure. One is the true definition. And if your goal is I actually want to put force onto this guy, then you want to use small parts of your body, right? Small surface area, like your knees, your elbows, your shoulders. If, on the other hand, you're trying to break them mentally, then that's a different thing. Then you're probably trying to just destroy their hope, create a sense of despair. And that's very much a different thing from actually generating physical pressure. So anyway, that's just a way to think about offense that I found somewhat helpful.
Yeah. It's funny, I was just debugging someone's S-mount the other day, and basically they'd figured out how to do an S-mount that was superficially with the legs in an S position, but they were both of their buttocks were essentially on my chest. So it's a fairly large area spread out over a fairly resilient area, and there's no, the PSI that's being exerted on my body is fairly low, and it's in the wrong place.
Mm-hmm.
But a couple of little adjustments, a little bit more rotation, moving that weight down just off of the ribs onto the diaphragm, and both types of pressure were immediately evident, right? You're shifting it from the relatively broad area of both buttocks to kind of just a corner of one buttock and your femur. So that's you've reduced the surface area by half, roughly. So you've doubled the PSI. And if you shift it down onto the diaphragm as opposed to the chest, it's not a smother per se, but yeah, you can choke people at the mouth and the nose, at the throat, or in their diaphragm. There are three places that you can choke somebody, and that generated immediate psychological pressure. So it's an interesting application of both of those concepts of pressure that you just mentioned.
Yeah. Now, the other thing to bear in mind too is if I am using smaller surface areas to connect with you, it's going to be harder for you to push me away and displace me, right? So if I am knee riding you, or if I'm holding you in side control and the main point of contact is I've got a cross face, my shoulder's driving into your jaw, it's going to be pretty hard to displace me because you can't just push off against my knee and get a lot of success, right? It's going to be hard. On the other hand, if I have a wide surface area on you, so in the example you brought, if I'm literally sitting butt to chest on you, that is pretty easy for you to generate force against me, right? A big bridge, and you're going to displace me entirely, which is probably what was happening when you were debugging this to this person, right? If you give people a wide, flat surface area that they can push off of, again, we're getting back to that combination of base, right? They can generate a lot of force against you. And especially if they're big and strong, it's very easy for someone to send you flying there. So I would always tell people if you're having trouble maintaining mount or a similar top position because you just keep getting bumped off, that's probably because you're making it too easy for the person to connect with you and generate force into you, which probably means you're either pushing too hard against them or you're giving them too much surface area, and that's like a handle they can push against.
Well, I'm glad we finished on how to make your training partners' lives miserable. We talked about ways to prevent white belt flight, and now you've switched to helping people quit at blue belt level because their lives have been made so miserable by top pressure.
Absolutely. I want your listeners to survive past white belt so they can make other people quit at blue belt. That's the goal.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for these 6 awesome mental models. I think this really will help people. I'm going to encourage people right now to go sign up for BJJ Mental Models if they haven't already. You're much more consistent than I am in the production of podcasts. So between your podcast and my podcast, they might just get 1.5 podcasts a week, and that's a pretty good start. So yeah, BJJ Mental Models. It's just audio, right? You're not on YouTube. So you do have to use a podcast player. Is that correct?
We are on YouTube, but we just do audio only on there. It's just easier to do editing. And honestly, I find that the benefit to forcing things into audio is it makes people think about things in a different way. So we're primarily audio, yeah. But you can find us on YouTube.
Okay. And you do have a premium program. What's in that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing that we're best known for is the BJJ Mental Models podcast. Beyond that, though, the way that we pay the bills and the way that we really super serve people is with BJJ Mental Models Premium. That's our subscription service. It's very different from what most people, I think, are probably used to and accustomed to. It's not an online academy in the traditional sense. When you join Premium, you're going to get a few things. First thing is you're going to get our complete library of concept and strategy classes featuring some of the best coaches in the sport. So it's not just me, but we often have specialists come in and talk about that stuff. It's much more structured in a learning approach than you would normally get through a podcast. Beyond that, you also get rolling reviews. We've got an amazing review team. Some of the people on our team include Brianna St. Marie, Margot Ciccarelli, Josh McKinney. We've got some amazing black belts on there. So for a lot of people, they're just not getting enough detailed feedback directly from their coach. That's where Premium comes into play, right? The idea there is that if you join and you sign up there, you send us your rolling footage, and then we will submit that off and get you reviews literally from some of the best black belts in the world. There's also an amazing community that we've got that we've built up as part of that. So if you're looking to network with other coaches or high-level competitors and learn from them, Premium is a good place to do that as well. Whole thing's on bjjmentalmodels.com if anyone wants to check it out.
Thank you so much, Steve, and I hope to see you sooner rather than later.
Thanks, buddy. Have a great day.